By now, in some of my explanations, you've probably seen me use prior work when solving some of the questions, but we haven't yet explicitly discussed exactly what prior work is and the best way to use it, and so that's what I want to do in this video. So what exactly is prior work in a logic game? Well, it comes from three different places primarily. The first place prior work comes from is the work that you have done on if questions. And so this refers to questions like these. Each of these give us a new condition that is introduced by the if, and generally speaking, the best way to solve these questions is to draw a new set of slots, a new diagram just for this question, incorporate the new information, so here the police officer would testify first, and then follow through on applying the rules to this new information. The work that we use in these questions should remain on our page, and we should be sure not to erase it because it can occasionally be useful on future problems. Now, the second place that prior work comes from is the work that we do to test answer choices. So sometimes we're doing a problem and we can't quite tell the difference between two answer choices. They look like they could both be true. In that case, we might draw one of the answer choices and just try to see if it works. Any possibilities that we draw when testing answers that actually follow the rules are, again, things that might be useful in future problems, and so we should keep it and not erase it to be used as prior work. Now, the third common source of prior work is the correct answer to an acceptable order or assignment question. This is usually the first question of any set of questions for a game, and it looks like this. These questions are asking us what could be a complete and accurate list of the members of a team, of the order in the game. It's basically asking us what could be one way that the variables are arranged. Once you get the correct answer to this kind of question, remember that the answer is an example of something that could be true, and so it can be useful on future problems. Now, because on the digital LSAT, it's hard to see the answers to the first problem that you do when you're working on the other problems, some people will actually, on their scratch paper, recopy the answer choice that was correct for this acceptable order or assignment question. They'll just list that in their scratch paper as a possibility in case they want to use that in the future. Now, another thing that a lot of people will do to help solve games efficiently is after doing the first question of the game, which is usually one of these acceptable order or assignment questions, they will then do all of the if questions first before going back to the non-if questions. That's because the questions that are not if questions can often be fairly difficult, especially if you didn't make the right inferences up front. And having a bank of prior work from these if questions, some of which number-wise may have come after the non-if questions, can be useful for solving those non-if questions. But prior work isn't going to be useful unless we know exactly how to use prior work and how not to use it. So in the rest of this section, I'll discuss how we can use prior work, as well as the kinds of questions where prior work is the most useful and the kinds of questions where prior work is the least useful, and then we'll also work through an example. So the most important thing to know about the prior work that you drew is that it is an example of what could be true or what could be false. The prior potential orderings or groupings that you've drawn are not necessarily what has to be true. They're just individual examples of things that do follow the rules. So you can use that work in any way that knowing what could be true or what could be false is helpful. So if, for example, you had prior work showing that R could go first and Z could go second, then if another question asks what could be true and it says Z is immediately after R, well, here we have an example of that being a could be true. Or if you're doing another question and it's asking what must be true, if an answer says R goes third, well, you know that that could be false because R could go first. So that's the sense in which prior work proves what could be true, but it can also prove what could be false. Now, there are a couple of questions where this kind of information is the most useful, and the first kind is universal list questions. These are questions that are asking us which of the following is a complete and accurate list of something across all the different possibilities. Here's an example. The first one says, which one of the following is a complete and accurate list of the letters, any one of which could go immediately before S? So this is asking across all the different possible worlds in the game, which answer is listing every single letter that could ever go before S, immediately before S. So I think of this as a universal list question. What is a universal list of everything that could go immediately before S? Now, prior work is especially helpful for this kind of question because if you have any example of an order where something is going before S, let's say you see something and it has Z going immediately before S like this, well, now you know that the correct answer has to have the letter Z, and you can get rid of any answer that doesn't have Z. The next example says which one of the following is a complete and accurate list of the teams, any one of which Johnson could join. So this is asking across all the different possible worlds, which teams could Johnson ever join? If we have any prior work where Johnson is on a particular team, let's say he's on the basketball team, then we know the correct answer has to have the basketball team, and we can eliminate anything that doesn't have that. So I find prior work to be an extremely useful method on these kinds of questions, and is often even the very first thing I do when solving this kind of question, is to look towards prior work. Now, the second kind of question that prior work is extremely useful on is what I think of as targeted must be true or must be false questions. So here's what I mean by that. Take a look at these question stems. The first one here says each of the following movies could be played last except. So you could think of this as a must be false question. The correct answer is going to be a movie that cannot be played last. This question to me is targeted because it is about a specific element in the game. It's about which could go last. Contrast this with a question that just asks which of the following must be false. A question that asks which of the following must be false, it could be about any aspect of the game. It's not targeted to a specific part of the game. This question, though, is a targeted must be false question. And in the second example here, this says which one of the following must be on the same team as Zion. So you can think of this as a must be true question. There's someone who always has to be on the same team as Z, and it's targeted because it's specifically about Z, who has to be with Z. The scope of the answers is going to be more limited than for a question that's just asking which of the following must be true. A non-targeted question could be about any aspect of the game, whereas a targeted is much more limited in scope. Now, the reason that prior work is extremely useful on this kind of question is because your prior work is very often going to allow you to eliminate answers. It's almost a guarantee that any prior work you do, even if it's not that much, is going to help you get rid of wrong answers. For example, if you have an order where you have, let's say, the comedy movie played last, well, then you can get rid of that as an answer if it appears on this question. Now, on the must be true question here, if you have prior work showing that Albert and Bob are not on the same team as Zion in one of your prior possibilities, then that's proving that they don't have to be on the same team as him, and you can get rid of anything that says Albert or Bob if it's in the answer choices. So looking at prior work is again one of the primary strategies to help eliminate answers on targeted must be true or must be false questions. Now, the third kind of question where using prior work is especially useful is rule substitution questions. So those are the questions that ask something like this. Which of the following, if substituted for the constraint that Kenton and Stevens can't be on the same team, would have the same effect in determining the assignment of students to teams? Now, I cover rule substitution questions in detail in another lesson, but for now you should know that prior work is useful on these questions because the correct answer to a rule substitution question has to be something that must be true under the original set of rules. If answer choices in your rule substitution question are saying things that don't have to be true as shown in your prior work, then you can get rid of those answers. And that is a primary strategy that I use to make these questions feel easier. So these are the kinds of questions where using prior work is the most useful, and it is often a primary strategy for these questions. But now let's talk about where prior work is just moderately useful. And that's on questions that are just non-targeted must be true or must be false questions. Questions that are just asking which of the following must be true, which of the following must be false. So here we have some examples, and I want to discuss why using prior work on this kind of question can be useful, but it can also just get in the way. So let's say we're asked which of the following must be true, and we are doing a grouping game involving people joining different sports teams. Now, most of the time, if this kind of question is asked, a non-if which must be true question, the answer is going to be an inference that we could have made at the beginning of the game. Or while we were working through other questions, we may have stumbled on this inference. So let's say the correct answer happens to be C, L joins the basketball team. If a student is relying on prior work as the primary way they're going to think about these answer choices, then it might take them a lot longer to get to the answer, especially if they already made this inference at the start. If they already saw that one of the big deductions in the beginning was that L had to go on the basketball team, then they could just scan the answer choices and pick it. But if they expect to rely on prior work, then what might happen is they'll start by reading answer choice A, J joins the same team as Z. Then they'll look for all of their prior work to see, is there any time where J's not on the same team as Z? Now they may or may not see it, and so they might not be able to get rid of answer choice A. Then we go to answer choice B, L joins the volleyball team. They'll look through all their prior work, and they'll see L's not going to be on the volleyball team, and then they'll remember, oh yeah, there was this inference about L joining the basketball team, and that's when they'll pick it. So on individual questions, using prior work and checking back for every single answer could actually just get in the way when you already can see the deduction that the question is testing. That's when using prior work is not that useful on a must be true or a must be false question. But if you didn't make the inference up front, that's when it can be useful, because if you're stuck on an answer, you can use prior work to eliminate an answer. You can often eliminate 1, 2, or 3 answer choices, and that really just cuts down on how intimidating the problem is. If you're just left with 2 or 3 answer choices, then it feels a lot easier to just try the answer directly and plug it in to see if it works. So that's why prior work is moderately useful on this kind of question. A lot of it depends on whether you made the relevant inferences, and also on how easy the answer choices are to evaluate against your prior work. So to summarize the difference between these two categories of most useful and moderately useful, for these questions under the most useful category, using prior work is essentially the first thing I'll do to help me eliminate answers. Whereas in the moderately useful category, which are the non-targeted must be true or must be false questions, I'll use prior work more as a secondary strategy. If I'm having trouble evaluating the answers, or I can't quite tell based on scanning through what must be true or what must be false based on an inference, that's when I know that prior work can often help in eliminating 1 or 2 answer choices. And sometimes, if we're lucky, more than that. Now let's talk about where using prior work is the least useful. And remember, I'm using the word least useful. That doesn't mean not useful at all. In this category, we have the could be true or could be false questions. Now, the reason I find prior work to be the least useful on this kind of question is that your prior work is only ever going to show what answer must be correct. And what I mean by that is, let's say we're doing a could be true question, and we're presented with these 5 answers in an ordering game. And let's say that the correct answer happens to be D, L could finish 4th. The only way that prior work is going to be useful on this question is if you happen to have prior work where L finishes 4th, because then that would allow you to prove that D could be true. But there's a very high chance that the prior work that you have isn't going to be enough to just see that D is correct. And in that case, if you're wasting your time looking back at all of your prior work for A, B, C, and E, that might just be getting in your way of thinking about the rules and how they interact, and using the rules directly might be an easier way to see that L could go 4th. And you'll see what I mean when we work through an example in a moment. So for this third category where prior work is the least useful, the could be true or could be false questions, I think of the prior work as a bonus. Sometimes you happen to just see that prior work proves an answer correct, but most of the time the answer is not going to be in the prior work, and you're going to have to think about the rules and think about the inferences. Now, by the way, if it is a targeted could be true or could be false question, rather than a non-targeted one, so for example, if the question's asking which of the following could go second, well then prior work becomes more useful, and it definitely does not hurt to just scan the prior work to see if you have the answer available to you easily. So let's see some of these ideas in action. And here we have an ordering game where you have 7 different slots. You have N, P, S, R, W, X, Y, and here are our rules. I've already diagrammed a lot of these rules. W is going to go in 1 or 7. S has to go immediately before R in a block. Y is somewhere before N, P and N cannot go next to each other, and the third spot has to have either P or Y. Now let's say in the course of doing the first question and doing the if questions, we happen to have this set of prior work. Feel free to pause and study the prior work if you'd like. Now remember, these 4 diagrams here are not an exhaustive list of the possibilities of the game. These just happen to be the things that we worked through for particular problems. So these are things that could be true. But this is not everything that could be true. Here's our first question. You can go ahead and pause and try this on your own. This is asking which of the following is a complete and accurate list of the letters, any one of which could go immediately before S. So this is a universal list question of the letters that can go immediately before S, and this is one where prior work is something we should look to first. Because if we can see that we have letters that go before S, Y is immediately before S, N could go immediately before S, and P could go immediately before S, we know that the right answer has to have Y, N, and P. That gets rid of the first 3 answer choices. Now we're only down to D versus E, and the difference between them is E has W. Could W go immediately before S? Well, if that were going to happen, W would have to go first, and then the S would have to go too, but this is where we run into a problem, because now we have no room for the R. So that's why W cannot be immediately before S, and D is the correct answer. Now, can you imagine how we would solve this question if we didn't have this prior work? We would be basically forced to try to put SR in 4-5, 5-6, and 6-7 so that we could see what goes immediately before it. And this is the kind of question that I would definitely skip and come back to if I still had if questions remaining after this one. Here's our next question. Go ahead and try this one on your own. This is a targeted must be false question. It's asking each of the following could go second except. So the right answer is something that cannot go second. And here in our prior work, we already see P could go second, X, R could go second. So P, X, R could go second. That's going to get rid of these 3 answer choices. We're just down to A versus E. And it doesn't matter which one we try, because if we prove that N could go second, then that means E is going to be the answer. And if we prove that N can't go second, then A is going to be the answer. So let's try N. If we put N in 2, that means we have to put the Y before it. But now we run into an issue because Y or P has to go third. Y being in 1 means that P will now go third. But we have a rule saying that P and N cannot go next to each other. So this is not allowed. That is why N cannot go second. Now it happens to be the case that if we didn't have any prior work and we just tried A, B, C, D, E in order, we would have seen that A was the answer pretty quickly. So it might seem like the prior work didn't help, but imagine if the correct answer happened to be at the very end. Then if you just try A, B, C, D, E like that, it's going to take a long time, and the prior work actually would have cut down on a lot of the time you needed to evaluate the answers. Here's the second to last problem. Go ahead and try this on your own. The question is asking which of the following must be false. So 4 wrong answers could be true. The correct answer cannot be true. So let's go through these answers asking, could this be true? Could P be immediately after R? Well, looking at the rules here, I don't see why we couldn't put S, R, P like this. So that seems like something that could be true. I'm going to move on. I'm not going to get rid of answer choice A. B says W is immediately after R. And again, I don't see why we couldn't just put S, R, W like this. So that seems like it could be true. I'm going to move on to answer choice C. C says W is immediately after P. And yeah, why not? I mean, you could put a P over here and a W over there. Maybe that's not going to work out, but it's not clear to me why that wouldn't work. D says N is immediately after Y. And you know what? I'm not sure about that. Y is before N. Couldn't you put Y and then N right after it? Doesn't seem like that's false. E says S is immediately after W. And let's see, could we put S immediately after W? Well, that would have to look like this. Oh, but SR is a block. And so that's why you couldn't put an S immediately after the W. The W would go in 1, the S would have to go in 2, but now the R has no place to go. So that's why E is the answer. Now, with the way I solved it, I didn't actually rely on the prior work, and this is an example of a problem where the prior work might have been helpful, because I think it can eliminate some of these answer choices. You can cleanly get rid of answer choice B, because there you see W after the R, immediately after R. You can also get rid of answer choice C, because In this prior work, we see that W could go immediately after the P. And you can also cleanly get rid of answer choice D because you can put N immediately after Y. That's what you see over here. So that's why I was saying that this kind of question is one where prior work is moderately useful. If you were really stumped on B, C, and D and were not really sure about whether it could be true or must be false, then a strategy where you look at prior work could have just helped you get rid of those answers much more quickly. But then you have to balance that approach with other problems where maybe none of your prior work would have helped you eliminate these answers, or maybe it would have only helped you eliminate one answer, and then you're still stuck with evaluating the answer choices. Maybe the prior work just got in the way. So that's why when you're doing games on your own and redoing games, pay special attention to how you use prior work so you can develop a method that works for you. Go ahead and try this last problem on your own. The question's asking which of the following could be true. A says S goes second, but the S has to have R immediately after it, and if you put S second, you have no room for the R because the P or Y is in 3. B says N goes first, but we know that the N comes after Y, so there's no room to put N in first and the Y before it, so B is not correct. C says N goes fifth, and it seems like that could be true because you could put N in 5 and just put the Y somewhere before it, so I'm not sure. C looks like it could be true. D says R goes fourth, but the R has to have the S immediately before it. So if you put R in 4, then you have no room to put the S because you have to put P or Y in 3. And E says W goes second, but one of the rules says W is first or 7th, so it can't go second. That means C is going to be our answer. Now notice that the way I solved it did not rely on prior work. Here's an example of a question where the way the answers were written and the way that we have our prior work would have made using prior work actually not helpful at all. Imagine a student who looks at these answer choices, looks at A, S goes second, and then looks down to C, do I see S in second anywhere? Then goes to B, do I see N in 1? Do I see N in 5? None of these answers appear in any of our prior work. So after going through all the answers and looking at prior work, they would then have to do the exact same analysis that we just did to get rid of the wrong answers. Now granted, sometimes the prior work does actually show you an answer that could be true, and if you see that, then you've just cut out a lot of analysis. So prior work is not completely useless on this type of could be true question, but I hope you can see why prior work can sometimes get in the way when the better way to analyze answers is really just to go to the rules directly and think about what the rules mean against that answer choice. Before you go, I want to recap what we discussed. Remember, prior work is an example of what could be true or what could be false, and it's most useful on these kinds of questions. These are the kinds of questions where I'm first going to look at prior work to help me eliminate answer choices. But if I'm dealing with a must be true or must be false question that's not targeted, that's just asking what must be true or what must be false, then prior work is more of a secondary strategy. It can be helpful especially if I didn't make the inference that the question is testing, but I also want to scan through the answers to see if maybe I can already see what the answer is without having to look back at prior work for every answer choice. And if the question is just asking what could be true or what could be false, then I'm not expecting prior work to be useful at all. Now, it certainly might be useful, and so if I'm stuck on the problem, it doesn't hurt to glance at prior work, but I'm not going to expect prior work to be of significant help on this kind of question.